Let me talk to you for a second. Yes, you. The one sitting there wondering if you're asking for too much, the one who keeps telling himself, maybe I'm overreacting, maybe I just need to try harder. You feel unseen, unappreciated, replaceable. And here's the controversial truth nobody tells men. When a woman doesn't appreciate your worth, the thing that hurts her the most isn't your anger. It's your silence. It's your emotional withdrawal. It's when you finally stop trying. Now wait. Before you assume this is about revenge or manipulation, it's not. This is about psychology. Research on attachment and emotional bonding shows that women, on average, are more sensitive to emotional disconnection than confrontation. Studies in relationship psychology suggest that perceived emotional abandonment activates deeper distress responses than conflict itself. So when you think, if she doesn't value me, I'll just pull back, you might be doing the one thing that creates the strongest emotional impact. But here's the deeper question. Why does it reach that level in the first place? Why does appreciation disappear? Why does a man slowly shrink in a relationship? And most importantly, what actually hurts her when she realizes she misjudged your value? Today, I'm going to break it down into 5 very clear, very uncomfortable truths, not to blame, not to attack, but to teach you how relationship dynamics really work. Let's start with the first one. 1. When you stop chasing her validation. Let me ask you something. How often do you explain yourself? How often do you try to prove that you're good enough? Now here's the uncomfortable truth. The moment you start chasing validation, you slowly lower your perceived value. And when you stop chasing it, that's when it stings. Why? Because psychology tells us something very simple. Scarcity increases perceived value. This isn't manipulation, it's human nature. When something becomes less available, our brain assigns it more importance. So when you stop asking, did I do okay? When you stop fishing for reassurance, when you stop trying to convince her of your worth, she notices. At first, she might not say anything, but internally, something shifts. Why isn't he trying anymore? Why does he seem calmer? Why does he look unaffected? And here's where most men misunderstand the dynamic. You think appreciation comes from overgiving. It doesn't. Research in behavioral psychology shows that overavailability often reduces perceived value in relationships. The more predictable and desperate the validation seeking becomes, the less emotionally stimulating it feels. So when you quietly regain your center, when you validate yourself instead of demanding it from her, that's when the emotional equation changes. But here's the key. This only works if it's genuine. If you stop chasing validation but secretly resent her, she will feel the tension. However, if you genuinely begin to respect yourself, improve yourself, and emotionally stabilize yourself, that's powerful. And that power, that's what hurts the most when it's no longer freely offered. Now ask yourself, are you seeking appreciation or are you embodying value? There's a difference, and that difference changes everything. 2. When you detach emotionally. Instead of arguing. Let me ask you something honestly. When you feel unappreciated, what do you usually do? Do you argue? Do you try to explain yourself? Do you raise your voice just to be heard? Now, here's the part that might surprise you. Arguing rarely hurts a woman the way emotional detachment does. Why? Because conflict still means engagement. Conflict still means investment. When you argue, you are saying, "This matters to me." But when you detach calmly, when you stop reacting, when your energy shifts from emotional intensity to emotional stillness, that creates uncertainty. And psychologically, uncertainty is uncomfortable. Research on attachment theory shows that emotional withdrawal can trigger anxiety in partners who are used to consistent emotional access. When someone who was once expressive becomes emotionally reserved, the brain starts searching for explanations. Did I push him too far? Is he losing interest? Why does he seem distant? Notice something important here. This is not about giving the silent treatment. That is passive-aggressive and unhealthy. This is about regulated detachment. There's a difference. Regulated detachment is when you decide, I will not overreact. I will not over-explain. I will not fight to be respected. Instead, you step back and observe. And here's the truth most men don't realize. Emotional self-control is powerful. Studies in emotional intelligence consistently show that individuals who regulate their emotions instead of escalating conflict are perceived as more stable and more valuable. When you stop arguing every point and start conserving your energy, you shift the dynamic. Suddenly, she feels the space, and space forces reflection. Now ask yourself this question. Are you fighting to win arguments, or are you building a presence that doesn't need to fight? Because sometimes the most impactful response is calm distance, not dramatic, not explosive, just steady. And steady can be unsettling when someone assumed you would always react. That's the shift. 3. When you upgrade yourself instead of begging. Let me be very honest with you for a moment. When you feel unappreciated, do you try to convince her to see your value, or do you increase your value? There's a difference, and that difference changes everything. Most men, when they sense emotional distance, go into negotiation mode. They talk more, they try harder, they become overly available. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Growth is more attractive than pleading. Psychological research on self-determination theory shows that people are naturally drawn to individuals who display autonomy, competence, and confidence, not arrogance, not ego, but visible self-direction. So when you stop begging for acknowledgement and instead start upgrading your life, your health, your mindset, your goals, your discipline, something shifts. You become less reactive. You become less dependent on approval. You become focused. And here's what quietly happens on the other side. When a woman sees that you are improving without trying to impress her, it forces comparison, not with other men, but with the version of you she thought she could take for granted. Now let me challenge you gently. If she stopped appreciating you, did you also stop challenging yourself? Sometimes lack of appreciation isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's familiarity, and familiarity often reduces perceived value when growth stops. That's not an attack, it's awareness. When you invest in yourself consistently, you create momentum. Studies on social perception show that forward movement in life increases perceived status and emotional attractiveness. People respect what is progressing. So the real question is this: are you trying to be chosen, or are you becoming a man who chooses himself? Because when you choose yourself, not selfishly, but with purpose, you radiate stability, and stability is hard to ignore. Now listen carefully. Upgrading yourself should never be a tactic to make someone regret you. It should be a commitment to your own standard. But here's the reality. When someone realizes they underestimated a man who is quietly leveling up, that realization hits deeply, not because you punished them, but because you outgrew the space they placed you in. Wake up gently, not aggressively. Stop negotiating your worth. Build it. 4. When you stop over-explaining your worth. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. How many times have you sat there explaining your intentions, clarifying your tone, defending your actions, just to be understood? And did it work? Or did it slowly make you feel smaller? Here's a hard truth most men never hear. The more you over-explain your value, the less it feels valuable. Not because you're wrong, not because she's evil, but because constant explanation signals insecurity. Psychologically, when someone repeatedly justifies their worth, the brain unconsciously starts scanning for flaws. It's called the over-justification effect. The more something is defended, the more the listener assumes there must be something to defend. Now think about this. High-value behavior is usually quiet. A man who knows his character doesn't write essays about it. He lives it, he demonstrates it, he allows patterns to speak. So what happens when you stop over-explaining? At first, it feels risky. You may think, if I don't clarify, she'll misunderstand me. But here's the paradox. When you calmly say less, your presence often becomes stronger. Because mystery commands attention. Research in interpersonal perception shows that people assign higher status to those who communicate with clarity and brevity rather than emotional over-communication. Calm certainty feels stable. Stability feels safe. Now, I'm not telling you to shut down or become emotionally unavailable. Communication matters. But there is a difference between communicating and convincing. If you constantly try to convince someone of your worth, you subtly position them as the judge. And here's the deeper shift. When you stop presenting evidence and start presenting consistency, something changes internally. For both of you, she either rises to meet your level of maturity, or she feels the distance created by your quiet confidence. And that realization, that you no longer feel the need to defend who you are, can be deeply unsettling. Let me challenge you gently. If you have to argue for respect, is it really respect? Sometimes the most powerful sentence you can say is nothing, and let your actions speak. That silence, when rooted in self-assurance, is loud, and it's hard to ignore. 5. when you quietly set boundaries and actually mean them. Let me ask you something that might sting a little. Have you been calling something patience when it's actually fear of losing her? Have you been calling something understanding when it's actually avoidance of confrontation? Here's the truth. The moment you set a boundary, calmly, clearly, without anger, and actually enforce it, that's when the real shift happens. And yes, that can hurt. Not because boundaries are cruel, but because boundaries remove access. Psychologically, boundaries activate what researchers call loss aversion. Human beings are wired to react more strongly to the possibility of losing something than to gaining something new. So when you say, "I'm not okay with this," and you mean it, without shouting, without threatening, you create clarity. Clarity can be uncomfortable. Now notice what most men do wrong. They announce boundaries emotionally. They threaten. They dramatize. And then they don't follow through. That doesn't create respect. It creates confusion. A boundary only has power when it's backed by action. When you calmly say, "If this continues, I'll step back." And then you actually step back. Not angrily, not vindictively, but decisively. That changes perception, because now you're not negotiating for basic treatment. You're defining your standards. And let me challenge you gently here. If she stopped appreciating your worth, did you ever clearly define it? Sometimes lack of appreciation grows in environments where expectations were never articulated. But here's the wake-up call. Boundaries are not about controlling her behavior. They're about controlling your participation. That's maturity. When you set boundaries without hostility, you communicate something powerful. I value myself enough to walk away from what diminishes me. And that realization that you will not tolerate disrespect quietly anymore forces reflection. She may resist at first. That's natural. Change disrupts comfort. But over time, consistency builds respect. Now ask yourself, are you afraid to lose her, or are you afraid to finally choose yourself? Because the man who chooses himself calmly, without noise, without drama, is the man who cannot be taken lightly. And that's when the dynamic truly changes. Let me leave you with something very controversial. Sometimes the reason she doesn't appreciate your worth is because you taught her she doesn't have to, not with your love, not with your kindness, but with your tolerance. When you accept emotional crumbs, when you over-explain, when you stay without standards, you slowly train someone to see you as permanent, not precious. And here's the truth most men avoid. Appreciation grows where boundaries exist. If this video made you uncomfortable, good. Growth usually does. I want you to comment below and tell me honestly, have you ever stayed too long where you weren't valued? I read these, and I reach out, because this isn't about blaming women. It's about helping you understand your role in the dynamic, so you never shrink yourself again. You deserve respect, but first, you must require it.